Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my webinar. I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to the Dean of the school for the opportunity to deliver this session. The purpose of the webinar is to explore how we can create effective multiple choice assessments. From my experience and from working with colleagues, we find that it's often challenging to write good multiple choice questions that do more than just test the student's memory. So by the end of today's webinar, I hope to share some of the practices that we have implemented at my university, my institution, but also share some research that has been published based on this particular topic. We will explore some of these, we will explore all three main areas. The first, we'll look at the general structure of multiple choice questions. This is something that you may or may not be familiar with, but I think it's important that we start with looking at the general structure and then build on this. Next, we'll look at constructing effective multiple choice questions. I have broken this element into two parts. First, we'll look at how we can design really good, effective STEM questions. And here I will be going through examples and practical tips to help you understand the various strategies and approaches that I want to share with you. Next, we'll then look at how to construct effective answers, or what we call alternatives, and to identify some of the common errors when it comes to writing multiple choice items. And lastly, we'll look at designing multiple choice questions to test higher order thinking. Here I will share some of the pedagogical research in relation to this topic, and I'll share some practical examples of how we've implemented this in our own assessments. And hopefully that will help you create multiple choice questions that assess all levels of thinking, not just applying knowledge or recalling information. So let's take a look at the anatomy of a multiple choice question. Now, by definition, a multiple choice question is a question which students are asked to select one alternative from a given list of alternatives in response to a question. Now, a good multiple choice question will consist of these three main parts. First of all, you will have a STEM question, and the STEM question will identify the question scenario or a problem in the multiple choice item. Next, you'll have the correct answer. The correct answer is also known as the key, followed by several plausible but also incorrect answers, which are known as distractors. Now, a good multiple choice question should have all these three elements within it, and students are expected to respond to a multiple choice question by indicating which alternative they believe is the best answer, or which alternative best answers the STEM. Now, if we take a look at this example here, I've just put together a really simple question, multiple choice question, where students are asked to express 50 milligrams into kilograms. Now, if we have a look at this example, the question here would be known as the STEM question. The STEM question doesn't always have to be a question. It could be a brief scenario or a case study. So there is scope with regards to how you design your STEM if we have a look at the options, these are known as alternatives. So within the multiple choice item, you'll have a list of alternatives that the students can select. Now, the alternatives are usually presented vertically, not horizontally, and preferably in numerical or chronological order to make it easier for the students to read and also to answer the question. Within the list of alternatives, you would usually have the key answer, and then the list of distractors as well. And the list of options should have one correct answer only. But if you notice, the distractors are also plausible answers, even though they are incorrect. So just to summarize the brief overview with regards to the general structure of a multiple choice question, students should be able to select one alternative from a list of alternatives presented in that multiple choice item in order to respond to a question. And the multiple choice question should also have a single correct answer amongst a list of incorrect answers. And just to kind of explain, after each of my topics, I will open the floor for you to ask any questions based on what I've covered before we move on to the next topic. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask based on the general structure or the anatomy of a multiple choice question?
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. So if there is any questions, you can go through the Q&A section. The screen, you will be having a Q&A. You can proceed your questions there.
Okay.
Clarifying the questions, we will move to the next session.
Okay, perfect.
I think in Q&A, there is two questions are there. Can you pick?
Yes, so there was a question that said that would there be recording, or will the PowerPoint presentation from this webinar, would it be available after the webinar? Yes, I'm happy to email a copy of the slides that I will be presenting in today's webinar for you to refer to at a later date. So yes, that's no problem.
I think there is a question, it's there from Dr. Dalia.
Yes, so there's another question that asks, does it matter how many incorrect answers we have? So common practice is to have anything from a minimum of 3 alternatives up to 5 alternatives as your options. So let's say we have 4 alternatives. 1 should be the correct answer and the other 3 should be incorrect answers. So it could be, so your list of alternatives could range from 3 to 5, and within that number there should be 1 key or correct answer from your list. There's another question that asks, what is the ideal number of alternatives? Again, it could be anything from 3 to 5. In what we do at my institution, we have a list of 4 alternatives, and we just keep that number consistent, not just throughout the module, but also throughout the department as well. Okay, I have another question that says, is it necessary to have 4 options? Again, no. Sometimes constructing multiple choice questions can be quite time consuming, and apart from setting a STEM question, you've got to find or put together a list of alternatives. So if it's quite hard or quite challenging to have a list of 3 distractors, limit it to 2 distractors along with 1 key answer as part of your multiple choice question. Right, there's a question about best answers. I'm not too sure what the question is asking, but I'll try and answer it anyways. So when it comes to multiple choice, you can have two types. You can have a single correct answer. So that's essentially from the list of alternatives, there's only one correct answer. You could also have multiple choice questions where from the list of, let's say, 4 alternative answers, students must choose the best answer. So the list of 4 alternatives are plausible, are correct, but only one best answers or best suits the question at hand. In our institution, we base our multiple choice questions on the single best answer approach. Okay, so there's a question that asks, can we add the answer options such as all of the above or none of the above in an MCQ question? I'm very glad that you've asked that. That will be something that I will be covering in the next slides. But just to give you a quick answer, I would say avoid using answer options such as all of the above or none of the above. And in my next slide, I will explain why. But just as a quick answer, I would suggest avoiding it.
Okay, Doctor, we can move to the next session, I think.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. We can go to the
Okay, I will be happy to answer all the remaining questions if we have time at the end. Okay, so next we are going to look at how we can construct effective multiple choice questions. Now, there are so many advantages to using multiple choice questions for assessments. One, it's easy for us to mark. 2, it can be used to assess, it can be used as an assessment for a large class size or large cohort, but also a well-designed multiple choice question allows us to test a wide breadth of content and learning objectives as well. But it's also reliable in the fact that students are less likely to guess the answers if we construct our multiple choice questions effectively. So in this section, I will be sharing some suggestions based on research and from my experience of how you can design effective multiple choice questions. If we begin with strategies for designing our STEM questions, there are 4 key principles that I incorporate in my own practice, which I'd like to share with you. The first principle is to make sure that the STEM question or the case study or the brief scenario is meaningful by itself. What I mean by that is that each STEM should be based on a specific problem and not multiple. For example, we can do this by asking ourselves, what is the learning outcome that we want to assess for this particular question? So with multiple choice questions, you're usually testing a much smaller, a more focused piece of knowledge for each question. So if we approach our design for the STEM question in this way, not only do we ensure that we're examining students' knowledge based on the learning objectives for that particular course or that particular module, but it also helps our students understand what they're being asked. The next important thing, which falls under this first principle, is to make sure that we express the full problem in the STEM. Now, If we express the full problem in the STEM, that makes no room for ambiguity or uncertainty from the student's point of view with regards to what the question is asking them to do. So as a guide, and again, I implement this in my own practice, when you're writing your own STEM multiple choice, ask yourself this question: would a student be able to answer the question without looking at the list of alternatives? If the answer is no, then it's likely that the STEM question isn't clear enough, and you may need to rephrase the question better. And we'll look at some examples in the next slide. But I wanted to cover this last element. So the last thing, which also falls under this first principle, is that we want to make sure that the STEM question tests the student's understanding, not just testing their memory or ability to recall information. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, it's fine.
We cannot see your slides.
Oh, apologies. Can you see them now?
Yeah. Now it's appearing. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I've just been talking from based on the first principle.
Sorry for interruption again. Can you repeat it, because the audience
Yes.
They missed the slides, please.
That's absolutely fine. Okay, right. So
yeah, thank you so much.
No, that's not a problem at all. Okay, so the first strategy that I want to share with you with regards to designing STEM questions are 4 key principles that we can use that we can incorporate in our own practice. So the first key principle is to make sure that the STEM question or the case study or the brief scenario is meaningful by itself. So for example, I would suggest structuring the STEM question based on a specific problem and not a range of problems. And we can do this by linking a learning objective to the multiple choice question. With multiple choice questions, you're testing a much smaller and more focused piece of knowledge with each question, so that if we approach our designing of the STEM question in this way, so make it more specific, make it more focused, we ensure that we're examining the students' knowledge based on the learning objectives for that course or that module. It also helps our students to understand what they're being asked to do as well. The next element which falls under this principle is to ensure that we express the full problem within the STEM question, so that there can't be any room for uncertainty from our students' point of view with regards to what the question is being asked of them. So if we make sure that the STEM question is written fully, clearly, the students are clear with regards to what they need to do, how they need to answer the question. As a guide, it's useful when you're writing your question to ask yourself, would a student be able to answer the question without looking at the list of alternatives? And if the answer to that question is no, then your STEM question isn't clear enough, and then you may want to reword or rephrase that STEM question so that when they read the question, they should be able to answer it without having to look at the list of alternatives. The last thing, which also falls under this first principle, is that we want to make sure that the STEM question tests the student's understanding, not just the memory or ability to recall information. And we'll have a look at higher order thinking as part of this, as part of the webinar. And I'll share some practical suggestions of how you can structure your multiple choice questions so that it tests higher order thinking. It tests the student's ability to apply information and interpret information. So I have an example here of a multiple choice question, which basically is which says what you should not do. So I've got this question here, and I feel that this STEM question isn't meaningful. If you look at simply the STEM question itself, it doesn't clearly state what the problem is. It says which of the following is a false statement. And if you were just given this question in your exam, you wouldn't be able to answer the question clearly without having to look at the list of alternatives. So to emphasize, the question should be based on a specific problem which is linked to the learning objective, but also you should express the full question in the STEM so that the student should be able to answer it without looking at the list of alternatives. The next approach or principle is to avoid using excessive wording or irrelevant information in the STEM. When you're writing STEM questions, try and use familiar language and same terminology that you've used in the course, in the lectures, in the workshops, in the tutorials, language that students have been are used to hearing you say and are familiar with. Research also shows that the use of irrelevant material in multiple choice questions also decreases the reliability and validity of the test scores as well, as it's very difficult to indicate what knowledge the students have. You can't tell if the student has clearly understood the question or if the student doesn't know the answer to that question. And if students are confused by the question, they tend to waste time trying to understand the question instead of focusing their time on answering the question. And also students, to help students with this, it's very important to use simple sentence structure, precise wording or terminology, so that the STEM question is easier to understand. And as a guide, as we design our questions, is to be very accurate with our word choices, so that the question is clear. And if you're certain and if you're confident that your question is clear, easy to understand, then it gives you a better indication with regards to the student knowledge by what they select as their answer. So I have an example here of an example multiple choice question where there's too much information. There's some elements of the question are irrelevant, and the question could be simply rephrased by what I would suggest, including this element here. So just simply asking what the characteristic of simply asking what characteristic is relatively constant in mitochondrial genomes. The information at the top is irrelevant. It's not necessary to help the students answer the question. So the better way of rephrasing the question would be here. It's straight to the point. It has the key terminology. Without having to look at the list of alternatives, a student who has studied, who revised, should be able to answer the question without looking at the list of alternatives. So that's just an example, practical example of what I mean by avoiding the use of irrelevant information in your STEM question. The next key principle is to avoid negative statements. So statements such as which of the following is not correct. Other negative phrases are never, unless, rarely, things like that. I would suggest avoid using it. Again, research has shown that students often have difficulty understanding items with negative phrasing. It has an impact on their cognitive processing, and yes, students often struggle with that element. But there are times where you have to use negative phrasing, maybe because the learning outcome of your course requires it. Then I would suggest the following. So if you are going to use negative phrasing, the items should, your STEM question should be phrased in a way that the negative phrasing is clearly portrayed. And I will show you an example of what I mean in the next slide. The next important thing to remember is that the negative word should be placed in the STEM question only and not in your list of alternatives. So if you have to incorporate a negative statement, include it in the STEM question only. And lastly, any negative statement should be emphasized by using italics or bold typing or capitals or underlined or all of the above, just so that it's clear, it stands out from the question so that the students are aware that it's a negative statement. An example of this, I have a question here where it asks students which of the following is not a route of drug administration. So notice that the negative statement is highlighted in bold, in capitals, and also underlined. But in my opinion, this question could be better rephrased so that the negative statement or the negative word is not incorporated. And I've got an example of how I would rephrase this question better. So I would rephrase this question like this. So all of the following are routes of drug administration except, and then you've got the list of alternatives. I feel that this is a better way of structuring your question. It still portrays the message, but you're just not using negative phrasing in the question. The last principle that I want to share with you with regards to constructing STEM questions is to make sure that the STEM question is complete. It's not a partial sentence or a what we call a fill in the missing word type question. It's a complete question. Again, research has shown that where you have questions that have a blank or a gap, increases the students' cognitive load. They spend more time trying to understand, how to fill in the gap or why there is that gap. And it's not useful for you to understand if they know the topic at hand. So do avoid using partial sentences. The better way of constructing your STEM questions is to write the whole question fully, so that students can then focus on answering the question at hand and not worrying about the partial sentence. And I've got an example here in this next slide. So an example of a partial sentence which we should avoid in our practice would be this. So we've got a question, and as you can see, you've got this fill in the gap that the students have got to, from the list of alternatives, select the correct answer to fill in this gap here. A better way to rephrase or structure your multiple choice question would be like this. It's the same question, but you're rephrasing it in a different way. By simply looking at the question, students would be able to select the correct answer if they know it, without having to look at the list of alternatives. So if possible, write the full question, STEM question fully, and avoid using partial sentences. So those are the 4 strategies that I commonly implement when it comes to constructing STEM questions. I now want to share with you 7 key principles that are really useful when it comes to constructing your alternatives within your multiple choice item. So the first principle that I like to share is that the list of alternatives that you include in each multiple choice question should all be credible and plausible answers. If they're not plausible answers, then they don't really serve as good distractors. If we have a look at this example below, you can see that all of the alternatives are relating to the topic of pharmacy and pharmaceutics. So they're all plausible answers to this question that asks which of the following is not a route of drug administration. But a student who has an understanding of the key routes of drug delivery will be able to easily identify that dissolution is relevant or related to pharmaceutical analysis and not a route of drug administration. So just to emphasize, the list of alternatives should be plausible, credible to the question. Something that would not be plausible would be, for example, replacing this answer with diffraction. Again, it's got nothing to do with pharmacy, and a student who hasn't really studied or doesn't really have a good understanding of pharmaceutics or pharmacy would be able to kind of see that diffraction does not relate to drug administration. So remember, the role of an incorrect alternatives, or the role of incorrect alternatives, is to serve as a distractor. And you'll find that students who have not achieved the learning objectives will select one of the distractors as their answer. But those who have achieved the learning objectives and do really understand the topic will select the correct answer from your list. Another point which follows on from the previous point is that there should be only one key answer within your list of alternatives. If you are acknowledging that distractors may have an element of plausibility, but being aware that there should only be one best answer from that list of plausible answers. And in practice, in my institution, what we do to ensure that we follow this principle is that we internally moderate each other's exam papers before the students sit the exams. So if I have a module that I'm producing an exam paper for, and I have a colleague who's also producing an exam paper for a different module, we'll swap exam papers, and we'll look at the content, we'll look at the structure of the questions, we'll look at how the alternatives are presented, and we'll moderate that, we'll give each other feedback. And colleagues within my department of pharmacy will comment on not just format, but also we'll look at if the question is scientifically sound, if there's only one correct or one single best answer for each of the multiple choice questions, if keywords in the STEM are used, if there's not irrelevant text, just like I've shared with you before in the based on the key principles in designing STEM questions. But most importantly, we'll also give feedback on if the question really tests the learning objective for that module, and also if the question is appropriate for the level of the cohort. So a question or a paper for first year may require a different level or difficulty, for example, another exam question for final year. So we like to internally moderate each other's exam paper, give feedback, so that the exam question, the multiple choice question, are clear, and it covers all the points that I'm going to cover in today's webinar. Another key point to mention is that when it comes to your alternatives, they should roughly be at the same length. And also, I'd like to add to that the same similar content, and I'll explain that in a second. So if your alternatives are heterogeneous in content or length, they can potentially provide clues to students about the correct answer. And if that happens, you're not able to determine if the student understands the topic or simply if they selected it based on the clue. So I have an example here, and as you can see, the list of alternatives are roughly the same length, apart from this one here. And if you read each of the alternatives, they are quite similar in content, so that the student, once they read the question and review the alternatives, they would be able to determine if they understand the topic, which answer from the list of alternatives is the correct one. Now, if I had a question that was quite short for the first one, quite long for the second one, then it would give a clue with regards to what possibly might be the correct or incorrect answer. So try and keep your list of alternatives similar length, if possible. The next 2 points I wanted to share on the same slide, and that answers one of the questions raised earlier. As your alternatives, I would suggest avoiding the use of all of the above or none of the above. It is quite tempting to do that, but it's important to avoid it. The reason for this is, if we look at the reasons for avoiding using all of the above, first of all, when students see this as an option within the list of alternatives, they immediately know either A, 2 of the options are correct, so the answer must be all of the above, or they know that if they know that one of the questions, if they see that one of the options is incorrect, then they know that the answer can't be all of the above. I'll repeat that again. So if the students see all of the above, they either immediately think that A, they either see or know that 2 of the options within the list of alternatives are correct, so that they know that most likely the answer is going to be all of the above. Or if they know that one of the alternatives is incorrect, then they know that the answer cannot be all of the above. So it's very important for us to avoid using all of the above within our list of alternatives. If we do, we're encouraging students to guess the question. It also suggests that the question that we have designed isn't specific enough, and it's easy for us to give the answer away if we include all of the above. The reasons to avoid using none of the above: students tend to find this option quite difficult, research has shown. So having none of the above as one of the list of alternatives, they find questions incorporating that quite difficult to answer. Also, one disadvantage is that you can't really tell if the student knew the correct answer or if they guessed the answer by selecting none of the above. And also, you only know if he or she knows that the distractors aren't correct. So by incorporating all of the above or none of the above, it doesn't really tell you if the students have understood the question, have met the learning objective. Another element that I want to highlight is for us not to try and confuse or trick our students. Now, one suggestion that I just want to kind of share that we've implemented within my department is that we don't create distractors that are so close to the correct answer. The best way to explain it is in this example here. So I've got similar question to previous. Which one is the following? Which one of the following is a route of drug administration? Now, as you can see, the list of alternatives are quite similar, and this, I would say, is a way of tricking our students. A student may know that the correct answer is topical, but because the distractors are so close to the key answer, this is an example of tricking the students. Again, we don't want to confuse them. We want to assess if they really know the answer. So avoid using questions that are too, so avoid using alternatives that are too close to the correct answer. The last point I want to share with you with regards to constructing alternatives is that when designing your alternatives, it's very important to vary the order of the correct answer. Make sure that most of your correct answers aren't either option A, no, sorry, I'll repeat that again. Make sure that most of your correct answers aren't in B or C. Again, research has shown that lecturers often position their correct answers either as B or C options, but also to vary the positions and make sure that there's not a pattern for students to detect. From my practice, what I normally do after I have written the STEM question and listed the list of alternatives, I then go back and reorder the position of the correct answer so that I'm not subconsciously keeping the answers at B or C options, and there is no pattern for students to pick up when they sit the exam. Also, I think I've mentioned this, I've covered this in a question, make sure that you have at least 3 alternatives. The maximum I would suggest using is 5, but the average number is 4. So let's say we base our list of alternatives, the number as 4. There should be 3 distractors and 1 key answer as part of your list of alternatives. So just to summarize that section, when designing your STEM questions, make sure that the problem is stated clearly, as using simple terminology, avoiding using irrelevant information, avoid using negative statements if possible. If a negative word has to be included in the STEM question, make sure it's highlighted by italics, underlining, using capital letters, etc. Again, a summary for the list of when you're constructing alternatives, make sure that all your alternatives should be plausible answers, but there should only be 1 correct answer within your list of alternatives. Try and make sure that the list of alternatives are approximately the same length in text to avoid giving away clues as to which is the correct or incorrect answer. Avoid using all of the above or none of the above as an alternative option, and vary the position of the correct answer to avoid students guessing or detecting a trend. So hopefully that section was quite useful for you. I will open the floor to some questions now, if you have any.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. So it was a somewhat clear section that it will cleared most of the doubts. There are some questions are here.
Yes.
We have an answer. I think from Mir Javed, one question was pending from the previous session, I think.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so just to answer the question with regards to what about one answer which is most appropriate, I'm not too sure what you mean about that. I would suggest having a single best answer approach, so making sure that your list of alternatives are all plausible, but there is only one best answer which correctly answers your STEM question. There's a next question that asks, how much time should be given to answer each question? In terms of time provided. Okay, so again, the amount of time you allocate will depend on the question, the multiple choice question, and I will explain and touch on this in the next topic. It depends on the level you are asking of the students. So for example, if you're just asking the student to recall a definition, then you don't need to assign much time for the student to answer that question. But if you're asking a question, a multiple choice question that's testing a higher order of thinking, then you need to allocate a longer time for the student to read the question, process the question, analyze the information presented in the question. So the amount of time will vary based on the question, but I will expand on that in the next section.
I think Dr. Ayub Patel has helped us. He didn't ask the question. He helped this.
Oh, he helped.
Yeah, he helped us.
Okay. Well, thank you.
He's our best friend. He's from College of Medicine.
Okay.
Using the question mark software.
Ah, right. Okay. Okay, I'm just reading the questions. There's a question that asks, is the term acceptable? Yes, it is. But again, I would suggest just highlighting that keyword in capitals in bold so that the students are aware that that keyword is in that STEM question. Okay, I've got a question here with regards to negative questions. So the question says, what is the problem with using negative questions? So negative questions are suggested to be avoided because it requires a higher amount of cognitive load for students. Normally students under the exam pressure and the stress, they read the question, but they don't really highlight or pick up on the, if you ask the questions that incorporate a negative word. So, and sometimes when you incorporate negative questions, it's a process, research has shown, it's a process that requires too much negative loading on them, so it's suggested to be avoided. But like I said, if you do include it, just make sure that you emphasize the negative word so that students don't overlook the question and answer the question incorrectly. There's a question that asks, how can a multiple choice question measure higher order of thinking? Good question. I will explain all of that in my next slide in a few minutes. This question asks about is it a good idea to use none of the above or all of the above? Hopefully, my previous slide explains why it should be avoided. I would suggest no, based on the information that I presented in the previous few slides.
You're answering which question, Doctor?
Sorry, I was asked Mr. Javed Ahmed's question.
You skipped so many questions before, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the questions are coming very fast.
Very fast, but we can go one by one, order by order.
Sure. Okay. Let me scroll back to the top. Okay.
There is one question from Asim Muhammad Ibrahim Omar.
Okay. All right.
That's an interesting question, yeah.
Okay. So question asks all of MCQs which represent measure lower order of thinking. How can we prepare multiple choice to measure strategic thinking or extended thinking? Okay, so I would suggest, I mean, the multiple choice questions can not only measure lower order thinking, you can structure multiple choice questions to assess higher order thinking. But I know that in my university, what we do also to kind of assess the higher levels of thinking is that we will first of all present students with a multiple choice question that asks them to apply or evaluate something. And then we would link that multiple choice question immediately with a short answer or a long answer question so that the students can then apply higher levels of thinking with regards to generating new concepts or justifying a course of action or a decision. But sometimes multiple choice questions are quite restrictive with regards to just it's the way it's structured that you can't really kind of measure high level of thinking and allow students to express various elements such as their ability to kind of creatively think or and things like that. But hopefully I will touch more on this in the next slides. Hopefully that will also help answer the question. Okay. Okay, so there's a question that I will read out just to try and help understand the question. So earlier on, I said a question should be questions so that students.
Double in understanding, so I can help you.
Okay, it's Mr. Patel's question. Okay, so yes, so Mr. Patel's question relates to what I said earlier on, that I mentioned that a question should be a full question without, so that students should be able to answer the question without looking at the choices below. And it shouldn't start with phrases such as which of the following or all of the following, etc. And Mr. Patel's asked, do I think it's best to avoid this type of wording? I think yes. A well-constructed STEM question should be able to be answered in itself without having to look at the list of alternatives. So if possible, avoid using which of the following because it doesn't really add any context to the question. And the question should be in itself concise, should present the student with the scenario or the problem at hand without having to look at the options. Okay, so there's a question that asks, can we make students choose 2 correct answers? Again, I would suggest structuring your question or the multiple choice questions to have either a single correct answer or single best answer. Again, your multiple choice question should be linked to a learning objective, which is relating to your module or your course. And the multiple choice question, a question, should be specific and focused enough to test one element of a topic or of a knowledge of a topic. And again, if you have 2 possible correct answers, you know, it leaves a grey area because a student might pick one instead of both, etc. So I would recommend just having one single best answer as within your list of alternatives.
I think for this one, I would like to add one comment.
Yes, please do.
I think if there's 2 answers, that is a multiple answer question.
Yes.
It's not a multiple choice. It is a multiple answer question.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a multiple choice. When the students can have 2 answers, so it's a multiple answer.
Yeah. So so multiple in my institution, we normally we use short answer questions so that students can provide multiple answers, and limit multiple choice questions for single best answers. Yeah, if that helps.
I think there's some question from Dr. Yahya. Is it okay to use 3 options instead of 4?
Yes, it's absolutely fine. Again, research has shown that 3 a multiple choice question that contains 3 alternatives is also as reliable as a multiple choice question that contains 4 or 5. So yes, it's completely fine. And also, as you're designing your multiple choice questions, it's a lot easier for you as well if you keep it consistent with 3 or 4, etc. So it's, research has shown it's fine.
Sorry for interrupting you, Doctor. So your mic is okay. Sometimes your audio is very low.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, clear, but still low.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's okay.
I'll just adjust the mic.
Yeah, please adjust, please.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's now okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just finding some more questions.
There is one regarding the negative question statement is from Dr. Muhammad Ghazwani.
Okay, so there's a question that asks, is there a maximum percentage for using negative statements? Okay, so negative statements is a really, really interesting topic. I would say in an ideal world, if I was creating my multiple choice, I would not use negative statements, again, unless it's the learning objective requires it. If so, I would limit it. I would probably restrict it to a maximum of 2. And if the question had to be, if it was possible to rephrase the question so that there wasn't a negative word, just like in my example before, then rephrase it so there's not that negative word within the question. So yeah, if possible, rephrase it. If not, limit it to maybe 1 or 2, just because of the reasons that I mentioned before. Okay, I think there's a similar question that I answered before. How much time should be provided to students to answer each question? Again, the amount of time depends on the level of difficulty of the question. if it's a higher order thinking type question, then you would need to assign more time compared to a lower order thinking question. And I'll touch on that in the next slide. Okay, there's a question that says, when using all or none of the above, does it affect the level of difficulty? Assuming you mean the level of difficulty with regards to higher order thinking. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Again, as I mentioned before, if you include all of the above, students find this option the most easiest response, because they can clearly see if they know that one answer is correct or two answers are correct, they're most likely going to select all of the above, which makes it easier for them. Or if they, likewise, if they know that one or two answers are incorrect, they would select all of the above. Same, so they find all of the above questions quite easy. None of the above questions, they find it difficult. But I would suggest avoid using these two, because you don't really assess, you can't really tell if the student really knows the answer or are just selecting one of those options because they've guessed.
There's a question from Sarah Iqbal. There is, I think, something interesting about the vocabulary.
Okay, in terms of limited vocabulary, using antonyms as distractors, fine or not. I would say, okay, so that kind of falls along the topic of trying not to confuse or trick the students when it comes to creating distractors that are so close to the correct answer. There was a question that I used, an example question that I used, which students were asked. I'm just trying to find the question again. There was an example question in my previous slide where, as a simple lower order question, it asks students what the definition of efficacy is. So yeah, you could use an antonym, but I wouldn't. But I would suggest using distractors which are plausible answers, also within the context of the subject as well, so that again, you're not giving away clues. And students who really have revised, who've studied, who've achieved that learning objective will be able to identify the correct answer. So the list of alternatives should be all plausible, but also be relevant to the topic or the module, if that helps to answer the question. Okay, there's a question that asks, while making different models, is it better to change the order of the alternatives or change the STEM order? Okay, so what I normally do in my practice is that after I've taught each topic, I would spend time constructing multiple choice questions based on that topic, and then put together possible alternatives. Now, changing the STEM order, again, it probably wouldn't matter how the order the question appears in the multiple choice question in the exam, sorry. that, like I mentioned before, your correct answer within your alternatives, the position of the correct answer should vary for each question, so that you're not giving away clues to students, and you're varying the combination of answers. Hopefully that helps answer that question. Okay, there's a question that asks, would it not be best to place the alternatives in alphabetical order? So a good approach would be to list the alternatives in either numerical order or chronological order, so that, again, you're not giving away clues to students, and you've got that consistency throughout. So, yeah. Are you happy for me to move on to the next topic, and then I can answer some more questions at the end?
Yeah, I think one more question from Dr. Ayub Patel we can answer and we can move forward further.
Okay. Okay, let's see. So the question Dr. Patel asked, so which of the following and all of the, could you help me?
The question is about which of the following and all of the following it's better to avoid, because you are asking them to look at the choices in order to answer. Such a question cannot be answered without looking at choices.
Okay, so I would avoid phrasing the question as which of the following. Just as you said, a student can't answer the question without looking at the choices. So yes, avoid using which of the following. The best way to structure the question would be to incorporate a scenario or a or kind of real life example case study as part of the question. So for example, I had in one of my previous slides, I had a question that asked about so a rectal suppository is used to treat a fever. This would represent what type of drug delivery. That would be a better way to structure the STEM question instead of which of the following. But the next few slides that I am going to go through will kind of give some real practical examples of how we structure our own questions. I know there is one example that has which of the following, but yeah, do avoid it if you can.
I think we can move to the next section.
Okay.
Yeah, too much time. Then after that, we can go through the questions once again in the last.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. I request all the participants to register your questions. We can answer you in the end of the session.
Okay, so what we're going to look at next are some strategies to help you when it comes to designing multiple choice questions to test higher order thinking. Now, higher order thinking is more than just memorizing information and recalling or understanding information. If we have a look at this definition here, higher order thinking is defined as a cognitive process which involves students to tap into their analytical, critical, or creative thinking. And this is ideally what we want to examine and to assess with our students from first year all the way up to their final year of study. And from experience, it's a lot easier to design higher order questions when it comes to, designing short answer questions or even longer answer questions. But it is possible to test higher order thinking within multiple choice questions. So we'll look at some of these elements in the next few slides. Now, the various stages of cognitive process can be best described by using Bloom's taxonomy. There are various learning taxonomies, but I and we within my institution use Bloom's taxonomy just because we like the approach and the way it's structured. Now, Benjamin Bloom described 6 different levels of cognitive behavior, and I've listed them here from the most basic, which is at the top, remembering, to the most complex, which is at the bottom, which is creating. Now, if we go through these 6 levels and define what they mean and what they entail. So if we look at remembering at the top, remembering is us asking our students to recall facts or information or basic concepts. So that could be a typical multiple choice question where they've got to define what efficacy is. So they're just recalling facts. The next level of Bloom's taxonomy is understanding. And here we would ask our students to identify examples of principles or ideas, or interpret the meaning of a principle. So that could be, for example, what does professionalism mean? What does professionalism in the context of pharmacy mean? So that's applying or interpreting the meaning of a specific principle. The next level is applying. And with application, we are asking our students to use knowledge in new situations. So knowledge that they've learnt from lectures, workshops, but apply it in a new situation based on the given multiple choice question. And that could be, for example, a problem-related scenario, a case study. Next, we have analysis. And here, students are asked to apply critical thinking, to often analyze data or graphs and provide conclusions based on the information that they've been given. The next level we have is evaluation. And here students would be required to make a judgment or a decision or a course of action based on the information presented in the STEM question. And lastly, we've got creating, where students would be asked to put things together, put ideas together, generate creative thinking. So those are the 6 levels, where it goes from the lowest level all the way to the higher level of thinking. And it's important to remember that knowledge retention is key, is foundation for higher order thinking. So I'm not saying that if you have a multiple choice question that simply asks students to recall facts or to interpret a meaning of something, I'm not saying that's not important, that's not relevant. It is. I think multiple choice questions should vary in the level. So we're asking everything from the level 1, from remembering, all the way up to the higher level, and it should build on the level, because it's important for us to assess students' ability to recall key concepts, but also to be able to analyze data and information and draw conclusions. So I've got the Bloom's taxonomy presented in this pyramid triangle here. And we've got the levels from the lowest level all the way up to the highest level here. Now, based on this exams, the the exams should normally, the exam questions should be aligned with learning objectives. So when designing learning objectives, we need to make sure that the learning objectives of the course have been clearly stated so that we can use the learning objectives to determine what level of thinking is required. And in the next slide, I'll explain that. But commonly, in practice, Bloom's taxonomy suggests that when we ask students to understand or to recall facts, information, to interpret a meaning of a principle, that's usually lower order learning, that's lower order thinking. And commonly, multiple choice questions are normally based within these two categories. Higher order thinking falls within these four top categories, so from applying to creating. And commonly, you can assess higher order thinking based on structuring questions that either ask students to apply, analyze, or evaluate information. Now, it's very rarely that you will see a multiple choice question that asks students to create or generate new ideas. It's not really appropriate for multiple choice questions. And the reason is that you can't really ask students to generate new ideas or concepts within the context of a multiple choice question. It's too restrictive. For example, other assessments, that is possible. For example, in a project, finding a project, a viva, and quite possibly a long answer question. Yes, but normally for multiple choice questions, higher order thinking can be assessed by incorporating these levels of Bloom's, and lower order thinking are assessed by incorporating these levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So like I mentioned before, the learning objectives will help us structure and design our multiple choice questions. And from our learning objectives, we can determine the level of thinking that is required. And I've got this table here just to kind of explain what that means. So the table here, it lists some active verbs that are commonly used to explain the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So, for example, if we have a look at the two lower levels of thinking, some of the verbs that you commonly find, if you have a learning objective that requires students to apply knowledge, within the learning objectives, you'll see some terms such as describe, select, recall. So you'll be able to identify that, okay, this learning objective only requires my student to apply lower order thinking. Likewise, if we look at understanding, some of the key verbs that you'll see within the learning objectives are explain, discuss, identify. And from that, you can structure or design your STEM question. So I've got an example here where, again, this learning objective requires students to be able to identify the meaning of a term. So I could, based on this learning outcome, put together a multiple choice question which requires students to apply their knowledge. So recall a specific fact or information or basic concept. An example of the question would be to ask students to define what efficacy is. And I've got my list of alternatives. And if they meet and achieve the learning outcome, a student would be able to identify that the meaning of efficacy is also option B, potency. If we have a look at the higher order thinking levels of learning, and look at some of the active verbs that are required. Again, learning objectives will have things such as apply, demonstrate, interpret, so that you'll know that in order to meet this particular learning objective that has one of these verbs, I need to have a multiple choice question which requires students to apply their knowledge, to analyze data, to interpret something, to explore relationships, to draw conclusions based on the information presented in the STEM question. If we look at analyze, these are some of the key verbs, again, to analyze, to compare, to differentiate. If we have a look at evaluate, you've got some of the keywords to appraise, to summarize, to assess. And I won't include create because you can't really assess or design multiple choice questions to assess creative thinking. So some examples, if we had a learning objective that asked students to apply previous acquired knowledge to a given situation, the keyword here is apply, and that fits in with the Bloom's taxonomy level of application. So a suitable question would be, which of the following, and I appreciate I've started the question with which of the following, but the question, if you read it in context, students should be able to answer the question fully based on reading the question itself. So which of the following blood tests is used in the diagnosis and treatment of diabetes? So the student will need to apply their knowledge of the topic of diabetes and how it's diagnosed and its treatment in order to select the correct answer from the list of alternatives. Now, it can be really useful and helpful to design questions that require multi-logical thinking. By that I mean thinking that requires knowledge of more than one fact in order to logically answer the question. And I'll show you some examples of how a multiple choice question can cover this as well. So just some examples of how you can approach structuring multiple choice questions in order to assess higher order thinking. One approach that we use within my department is that we use real life scenario based questions. So real life experiences, clinical examples, clinical scenarios that puts the topic that the students have learnt, it contextualizes it, it puts it into a real life scenario which they can relate to. Clinical kind of based scenarios are great for this. Another example is that you can also assess critical thinking skills or higher order thinking skills by asking learners to analyze or interpret information from visuals. So whether that is a diagram, a graph, etc. Asking students to, given a student a structure of a diagram of chromatogram or structure of a cell, if you're, if it's a topic relating to biology, and then structuring a STEM question based on a visual. That's really effective. And also what I often use when I'm designing my questions is I use my own research data as a question. So it could be a simple graph, a simple chart that I incorporate as part of the question, and students are asked to analyze, interpret and draw conclusions from the data presented. Again, that tests a higher order of thinking instead of just asking them to recall or memorize a fact or a concept. So I've got some examples of how that can be implemented. One example is this. So this question really is a good example of how you can structure a multiple choice question to assess application. So application is where students are using information or procedures and applying it to a new situation. So here we've got a type of, let's say, clinical in a vague sense example where there's a question relating to a patient with a specific age, and they, in the question, it details the blood glucose level of the patient, and the question asks the student what is the most plausible explanation of these numbers. So the students got to use their knowledge of the topic of diabetes. They've got some information, they've got some data, and again, that's incorporating some multi-logical thinking that they need to apply in order to answer the question. And if you notice, the list of alternatives are similar in length as well. So there's a high level of discrimination that the student has to apply in order to choose the best answer, because all of these answers are plausible. So they need to really understand the question, have a good knowledge about the topic in order to identify the correct option. Another example is this one here. Again, this question is a great example of how you construct a multiple choice question to test higher order thinking. This question falls within the realm of analysis. So you're here asking students to use the information or procedure I'll start again. You're asking students to analyze data to support a conclusion. So here I've got a graph and a brief caption below. And the STEM question simply asks, without any other data, which conclusion can you make from reviewing figure 17? So figure 17 is still part of the STEM question. So the student will need to review the information presented, analyze the data, understand the data, and then apply and draw conclusions in order to identify which answer from the list of alternatives is the correct answer. And again, this is something I like to apply in my own practice. I use some research data and just change the data to suit the appropriate level. So if it's first year, the data will be relevant for that level, etc. So some 4 things that I want to just to share with you and just to make you aware of, and this is coming from my own practice over the 6 years of designing assessments questions and multiple choice questions. Some things that I want to share with you to help you as you implement incorporating higher order thinking in your own assessments. One thing to remember is that constructing higher order questions, multiple choice questions, can be challenging. It can be time consuming. But what I have found is that when you're using key verbs from the learning objectives, like I showed in that table, use the key verbs to help you, so you'll be able to distinguish which learning objectives require lower level thinking and which learning objectives require higher order thinking. The key verbs within the learning objectives should be able to help you identify what levels to structure your multiple choice questions. The next thing I wanted to share is that, again, specifically when it comes to multiple choice questions that have higher order thinking, it's really important to have those questions moderated internally by your colleagues, just to make sure that the question does test the learning objectives. You've got the correct verbs that test higher order thinking, and also that you've got the STEM question is structured with enough detail. If you're testing students' ability to apply knowledge and have the right terminology, if you're asking the students to recall or remember a specific information. The next thing is that depending on the STEM question, you may need to add lots of content. So if your question is only testing knowledge or understanding, then you don't really need to add a lot of content in your STEM question. Like the example I had where the students had to define what efficacy is. You don't need to add more content to that. You can just present the question, what is efficacy, and then list the list of alternatives. But if a question, multiple choice question, requires students to analyze, apply, or evaluate a question, then you need to add lots of content. So like in the previous slide where I showed the example of a bar chart as part of the STEM question, you will need to design that, not just the question but also the data to match with it as well. If it's a case study or real life scenario, it will need lots of content so that the student, from reading the question, would be able to understand what is required and be able to answer the question. Again, in corporate scenarios, problem-based clinical scenarios, tables, graphs, charts, diagrams, etc., as part of your STEM question. And this last point helps answer some of the previous questions that were raised by colleagues. Students will need more time depending on the type of multiple choice question. So if your multiple choice question requires higher order thinking, if it's more complex in nature, so if you're assessing some of the higher levels of the Bloom's taxonomy, then you need to assign more time for the students to be able to read the question, understand the question, interpret the graph, interpret the data, and apply their understanding, draw conclusions in order to answer the question and select their answer from the list of alternatives. So depending on the level, what you're testing, more time will be given if it's quite complex. If it's only testing knowledge or understanding, then you don't need to allocate too much time for that specific question. And to summarize, the Bloom's taxonomy is a really, really good model that you can use to be able to determine if you are assessing higher order thinking. Do use active verbs to help you construct lower order and higher order thinking STEM questions. Use real life scenario based STEM questions. Use visuals, tables, charts, diagrams when you want to assess higher order thinking. And do, if this isn't currently implemented in your own departments, internally moderate your multiple choice questions and the whole exam paper by other colleagues and get feedback on the structure, the content, everything that I've covered in today's webinar. I'd like to say thank you so much for your time and your questions, and I will open the floor to answer some more questions if you have.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for sparing the very long, lengthy talk.
Thank you.
I think you need some refreshment.
Yes,
your voice is gone.
Yes, I was just going to take a glass of water now.
I will just review the questions and I will try to simplify for you.
Okay.
Have some water or some juice items with you.
Okay, will do. Okay, yes.
Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Thank you. So actually we have only we have 15 minutes left. So
okay.
You'll try to concise the questions. And there are some common questions I have seen. They are asking that whether we can use true or false questions or it should be avoided. There's one common question.
Okay, so You can use true and false questions. In my institution, true and false questions aren't usually implemented. What I will say is that if you have multiple choice questions that have single best answers, they are more reliable in terms of your ability to determine if students really have a deeper knowledge of the topic. If you have true or false questions, again, students are more likely to guess the answer if they don't know the answer, again, and from that you don't really know if they have a deeper knowledge. So we don't commonly use true and false questions just because it's easy for students to guess, compared to if you have a single best answer, students are less like, you'll have a better idea if students know the answer, or if students have guessed, if that helps, if I've explained it simply.
Yeah, okay. There's one more question. I think its answer is yes for that. Whether we can use the graphs or diagrams in the STEM.
Yes, you can. I would encourage you to incorporate graphs or diagrams in your STEM question, especially if you want to assess higher order thinking. Again, all that, the graphs or the data should be presented within the STEM and not as part of the list of alternatives. So yes, please do.
There is one more question from Dr. Kumar Venkatesan. He's asking that can we have two answers like both A and B in MCQ?
Okay, so I guess that is similar to either all of the above. Again,
I think it's better to avoid such type of options, isn't it?
Sorry?
It's better to avoid.
Yes, it's better to avoid. Again, having just one single best answer, it's best practice. You avoid students just guessing, etc. So yeah, I would recommend avoiding.
And there's one more question is there. Sometimes to increase the difficulty level, we need to prepare tricky questions. It's from Dr. Vipin Joshi. What should be the percentage of tricky questions?
Okay, the term tricky questions. I guess we don't want to trick our students. We want to be able to assess if they are able to achieve their learning objective. The amount of higher order thinking questions, so questions that require students to apply or analyze or evaluate information, should vary. Again, a good exam paper should have some of the lower order questions, but also a good number of higher order questions. Again, it varies depending on the module. It depends on the learning objectives for that specific course or module. But I think that a good exam paper should have some elements of recalling facts, some elements that require students to use their information on new situations, some questions to apply knowledge. Again, the higher order thinking questions will require a lot of time, a lot of energy and cognitive process for the students. So I wouldn't suggest having all of your multiple choice questions that assess higher order thinking, but just to vary it, increase it in level of difficulty.
Okay, there is one more question from, I think, Dr. Abdullah Shatur. What is accepted maximum words count for each question?
Okay, so there isn't a specific guideline with regards to a word count. Again, if I would suggest the question should be concise, should be brief, have the correct terminology. If you're asking, if the question only requires the student to recall information, then your question is going to be quite brief. But if it's to analyze data, then the amount of information might be quite extensive, might be a lot more, but there isn't a given guideline with regards to the word count, just to make sure that the information presented is relevant to the learning objective, is relevant, it's to the point, it's concise, it's brief, and there are no irrelevant information within that piece of that question.
Yeah, there is one more question from I think Raji Kaliyaperumal. I answered her, but I think she is not satisfied from my answer.
Okay.
STEM should be in question form or statement form or both.
Can I let me find that question.
The STEM should be in
Yeah.
question form or statement form, or it should be in both form.
Okay, so STEM should be, you have flexibility with how you structure your STEM. So a STEM could be a question, it could be a scenario, it could be a problem-based, it could be a problem-based, it could be a case study. So you've got flexibility with regards to how you structure the STEM.
Okay. And there is one more question, a series of questions from Dr. Ayub Patel. He was asking about the randomizing the choices. In there, we should also have in through the software, just like questionnaire.
Okay, hold on.
So
Okay, so I see a question from Dr. Patel. Okay, so research
options and randomizing the questions by using a software.
Okay, so in my institute, okay, so it depends on how you're delivering the multiple choice questions. If it's an exam where students are sitting an exam with a paper, then you would randomize the position of the correct answer. Other summative assessments where students have to complete a short quiz which comprises of a multiple choice question, yes, you can use software to randomize the questions so that especially if students are going to be completing the multiple choice at different times, yes, you can use software to randomize the position of the questions as well as the positions of the alternatives as well.
Okay. And there's one question from our Vice Dean Muhammad Ghazwani. In regard of making multiple module exams, what is the best way to arrange the order of questions, by which more easy questions can be come first and moderate to hard come later? And how can we keep a similar order if the concept is applicable in other modules?
Okay, so I would say that for my approach, I would increase the level of difficulty. So ask quite lower order thinking questions at the start and then increase the difficulty. It doesn't have to be like that. It's based on how your specific department or your module team prefers. The reason why I like to increase the level of difficulty is so that it builds the students' confidence in answering the questions. If a student, first of all, sees question one, it's a higher order thinking question, and they don't know, or they often struggle, and it kind of knocks their confidence. But where you've got a question that kind of builds on the level of difficulty, students, everyone should be able to answer the most basic questions, and then you'll be able to see as the level of difficulty of the questions increases, which students have actually studied well, which students don't really have a thorough understanding of the topic, etc. So I like to increase the level of difficulty. I know other colleagues within my department have a similar approach when constructing multiple choice questions as well.
Okay, done. Alhamdulillah. And the Tayyib also, he just supported for us he gave an idea. I think it should be by topic wise, as we have taught them. So difficulty should be according to the topic wise, based on the outcome, the objective of the topic.
Yes, I mean, the difficulty, yeah, can be based on the topic, but I think every topic you should be able to design a question that tests lower order thinking as well as test higher order thinking as well. There should be scope for every topic to assess both levels of thinking. Again, it depends on the learning objective as well for that module.
There is one question from Muhammad Mahtab Alam. Sometime knowingly we ask some difficult questions with confusing options, either to reduce grades or make pressure on students. How can we avoid this situation?
Okay, so one suggestion, again, to before the students sit the exam, to share your exam paper with a colleague, and just to make sure that the questions are written at the appropriate level, the correct difficulty, etc. Again, I think it's important to be able to have different levels of difficulty with questions. So there's nothing wrong with having a question that tests higher order thinking, where students are asked to justify or come to a conclusion based on a specific question. Not all students will be able to demonstrate higher order thinking. So it's important to have a range of questions that assess the various levels for the students. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you answered it. And there's one more question, is that how to measure the difficulty, level of difficulty, that a question is 25%, 50%, 75% is difficult. It is from Javid Ahmed. I think
How to measure level to clear a question. 20% of.
yeah, 50% or 75% is difficult. How to measure it? Difficult.
Yeah, I don't really understand the question. You have to mention level to give the.
Let me explain to you. Let me explain to what he mean in this question. Usually, in our colleges or in our university, sometimes we used to follow this type of instructions that we have to make the questions in 25%, 50%, 75% difficult.
Okay.
So how to measure it? How to measure the level of difficulty?
Okay, right, so I'm just going to go back to the Bloom's taxonomy triangle to help me answer this question. Okay, so can you see the screen okay?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, so looking at the Bloom's taxonomy, these are I would say, questions that ask lower order thinking. So these will be normally the easier type questions. So you could, if you have a specific requirement with regards to percentage, maybe say that you have a specific percentage, 25%, let's say, I don't know, that falls under these two categories. And then you have another percentage that assesses that have questions that assess students' ability to apply and analyze. And then you have another percentage of students questions that require students to evaluate. So you've got a range of questions of different amounts that assess a range of these levels. So students should all be able to at least achieve this level. But students who have studied, who have prepared for the exam, should be able to also answer questions based on these three levels as well. If that helps, if that answers the question, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, there is one more common question here. They are asking about what is your suggestion to make higher order thinking MCQs in medicinal chemistry? I think this is your field.
Yes. So are they asking examples or?
Yeah, they are asking examples or suggestions.
Okay. I'm on the spot now. Okay, so for medicinal chemistry.
Yeah.
Okay, so for example, you could have a mechanism. Let's just say an example of a reaction mechanism, and ask students to be able to identify what type of reaction that is. You could have questions relating to computational chemistry, where it's a problem-based scenario. Again, you can take that from research, and then ask students based on that, and that will be assessing the higher levels of thinking, because you've got some data, you've got a diagram of something that students will need to review, analyze, or interpret and draw conclusions from. I'm just trying to think. The scope, and I'm happy to add some more practical examples.
Conclude the session, because most of the questions are nearby repeated.
Yes.
So I think we can conclude the session.
Okay.
Yeah, we are going to finish. We are nearing the time limit. Here there is one question, I think the last one. They are asking some example. So that means, based on your experience, what is the main disadvantages of MCQ and assessment?
Okay.
Disadvantages.
Okay, so disadvantages. One disadvantage that comes to mind is that it's not, with MCQs, it's not an effective way to be able to test the student's ability to organize their thoughts or creative ideas. Yes, you can assess higher order thinking, but MCQs are quite limited if you want to, assess the students' ability to organize their thoughts on paper. And I think that's where, long answered or short answer questions really come in nicely in exam questions. Another thing, I don't know if this is something that you implement in your university, but also negative marking. We don't incorporate this, but if you do incorporate negative marking as part of your MCQ, it's very hard to know if students have understood the question if students know the answers to the question, because they might be presented with a question and they are 50% certain of the answer, but they do not choose to answer that question, because if they select the wrong answer, they will be negative marked. So those are some of the disadvantages that I can think of right now about of multiple choice. But I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. It's a lot more reliable. It can be easily implemented to a large cohort of students. You can test a broad range of course content, course material via multiple choice questions compared to short answer or long answer questions.
There is only one final question. There is something he's asking regarding the graphs and pictures.
Yes.
Could be assigned more than one question in each stem, especially when we're using graphs and tables?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
You can use it.
No, sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, could we assign more than one question in each stem, especially when we're using graphs and tables?
I would say that the STEM questions should be specific, should be really specific. So if you've got a graph within your STEM, it should only be for that one question. Yeah, it should only be for that question. If you want to ask further questions based on that piece of data, you can also incorporate that same graph or table in a long or short answer question, for example. But yeah, just to kind of make it more specific, more focused, have a data or graph for one MCQ question.
Okay, Doctor. Thank you so much. But I think we have to conclude because the session will expire. So,
No, it's fine. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me.
yeah, thank you so much. And I think we took a long time with you. It's a lengthy lecture you have given us, and I would like to thank the e-learning deanship, and Dr. Riyad is there with us in the host, and he's supporting us from the e-learning deanship. And I thank Dr. Our dean for giving us the great opportunity to have a wonderful session today. And I thank Dr. Elizabeth for giving your valuable time and your energy too. We took a lot of energy from you today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Let me
everybody.
conclude with